Hey, how we doing today, folks? It's Friday. It's still snowing. This needs to stop. We have more snow. I'm Dr. Wyman. For those of you who aren't aware or just don't want to remember. And thank you so much for coming today to our February Natural Science Seminar. It is an awesome day. We have 2 graduates, just like you, are going to be. We've got Nick and his wife Tori. They had different last names when they were here. Then they got married. That's all stories. So I met Nick spring of 2015. He and his dad came for a visit. He sat down in my office. We talked. In 5 minutes, was pretty obvious he was coming. He went through classes. He did a lot of work on his own. A tremendous number of research opportunities he jumped at. Graduated in 2019 and has kept working. He's finishing up his master's aquatic biology. Is that accurate? Aquatic biology at Grand Valley State. Tori was a year behind him, also my advisee. And she did a lot of external work. Lots of external opportunities for research. Graduated in spring of 2020. We call that the COVID graduation. And so she did it virtually. They got married. They're going now. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know what research they've been working on since then. That's the point of this talk. So please give them your full attention. Feel free to ask questions when you're done. And remember, they were just like you. Just like you. Not like me. Actually, they have hair still. Just like you. Hey, Tori and Nick, thanks for coming.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Wyman. It's great to be back at Spring Arbor University. Like he said, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit today about the research I've been doing since graduating Spring Arbor. So I'm going to be talking about the Great Lakes Coastal Wetland Monitoring Program. I worked for Grand Valley as a research tech, so I worked on this project and also Nick's thesis research, which he's going to go into a lot more detail on. I'm just kind of going to give you an overhead view of the Coastal Wetland Research Monitoring Program that I was a part of this summer. So, start off easy. What is a wetland? So wetlands are described as areas where water covers the soil either most of the year or the entire year. Some examples for you: marshes, swamps, bogs, and fens are a couple of wetlands. Examples. So how do we classify wetlands in our study? So we're classifying them by riverine, which is kind of self-explanatory, barrier, which is more protected, and then lacustrine, which is lake-oriented. So wetlands are important because they support several aquatic and terrestrial species. So birds, fish, turtles, frogs, you name it, macroinvertebrates, they support all of these very important aquatic and terrestrial species. They're actually among the most productive ecosystems in the world. The EPA compares them to both coral reefs and rainforests in terms of productivity. So why is that important? Well, they're important to these species because they provide both habitat and food for the life cycles of these species. Their unique plant stems and leaves are turned into organic material, which feeds the bottom of the food chain all the way up to the top. They also do important processes like cycling excess nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen that are in excess in many of these ecosystems from farming. They also practice carbon sequestration. So instead of letting carbon dioxide go up into the atmosphere, they actually sequester them into the plant communities within wetlands. They also prevent erosion by protecting the shorelines from wave action. So all these great plants that you have around coastal wetlands protect the shorelines that are currently experiencing erosion because of storms and climate change. So why are coastal wetlands being lost? This is an important question. Actually, 80,000 acres per year were reported to be lost between 2004 and 2009, which is a staggering statistic. And why is this happening? Human development, both urban and rural communities developing around coastal wetlands, are causing a lot of this acreage loss. Agriculture, runoff, extreme water level fluctuations are detrimental to wetlands as a result of storms and climate change. So wetlands are unique in where they have terrestrial, semi-aquatic, and aquatic plants that are kind of this array of different species that are experiencing different water fluctuations that make it difficult for these species to proliferate. And this is where the Great Lakes Coastal Wetland Monitoring Program comes in. It was started in 2011, funded by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and this has just helped a array of universities and organizations like Grand Valley, who I worked with, work together to monitor the status and trends in coastal ecosystems and wetlands and why are they experiencing these things. This will help inform wetland management and conservation by doing this long-term monitoring. As you can see from this map here, these are all our Great Lakes sites, and they are all in some way surfacely or connected or influenced by the Great Lakes, so that's how they chose their sites. These sites are also 4 hectares in size, that's qualification, as well as, like I said, connected or influenced by the Great Lakes. So our specific research objectives were how do resident fish communities by the Great Lakes differ by basin, so what Great Lake, as well as the wetland type, that riverine, equestrian, and barrier wetlands, as well as you can see behind me, this monodominant vegetation type is lily pad. So we focus on these monodominant, which just means these plants grow specifically in this area and are dominant. So lily pad, bulrush, phragmites, there's 23 different vegetation types, and that's what we focus on when we're doing our fish sampling. And here's an example of how we do that sampling. So if you look to this funny looking mat right here with the tape all around the edges, that's to protect from bird species pecking away at the fish we're trying to sample. So we plant 3 nets per zone, so we'll take our boat out, throw these nets in, hammer them into the ground, and the fish will get trapped within them. 24 hours later, we come back, haul the whole thing back in, dump it out, and we identify the fish species, and we measure them and collect them. We do also turtles sometimes go into the nets, and luckily no snakes this year.
Yeah.
So, what do these fish populations indicate to us? So they indicate species distribution, how that's impacted by the basin or Great Lake, the wetland type, and the plant zone. It gives us a better understanding of how fish use coastal wetlands for their life cycles, breeding, what fish like what kind of basin, wetland, and where they're proliferating within that system. As well as helps us to evaluate how invasive plants impact fish community diversity. As you can see in that last slide, this is Phragmites, which is an invasive plant species, but it is extremely common throughout the Great Lakes right now. Another data collection that we practice is water quality. So when we're going in and taking this fish and measuring and looking at them, we're also taking water quality measurements. So we account for pH, alkalinity, chlorophyll A, dissolved oxygen, turbidity, conductivity. All these things are measured using a YSI. So it's a sound applicator, and that will help us take all those collection measurements. I was introduced to the YSI through this project, which is really cool because it kind of gives a snapshot of the water quality in the area. Another favorite thing that I did on this project was macroinvertebrate collection. So throw on our waders, jump out of the boat, and we take a dip net and scoop into that great submerged aquatic vegetation to pull up all those macroinvertebrates, take them back into the boat, and as you can see here with our fancy little trays, we're picking them out with little tweezers, and we record the scoop number, and we time the picking that we're picking out these little moving macroinvertebrates out of our trays, which we put into ethanol, which are preserved, and we can later ID somewhere else that's not on a rocking boat in the middle of the lake. And macros are important because, like I said, a YSI is a snapshot of the water quality in the area, where macros are like a video. They kind of tell a story of the water quality over a long period of time. So what is the future of coastal wetlands? Well, this just emphasizes the importance of long-term monitoring because it can create a baseline for the health of the system over years and years, which will account for natural variability in the system, which will then help us contrast what climate change is doing, how temperature and precipitation are going to affect the wetlands, and their overall health and those species that they are habitated in that area, and as well as how future management decisions, as well as protection and maintenance of all the wetlands, and how we're going to keep these ecosystems running and protect them from all the changes that can occur as temperature and precipitation are increased. And these are my sources, and this is a bowfin, which is really slippery. Any questions?
When you were showing the map of the areas where you're doing the sampling, back to that, it looks like it's some areas it's really concentrated. Is that just because there are a lot of people there and it's easy to go there and you don't have to drive as far? Or is there some kind of environmental or physical reason for doing that?
So that's a great question. Yeah, there are a lot of clusters. They chose the sites based on those parameters that I talked about, the 4-hectare site, and as well as the monodominant plant zones. I suppose I'm not really sure as to why they're clustered. I know that they're sampled every 5 years, some 1 year, like every year. So I'm not exactly sure why they're clustered, but it could just be where those plant zones are located.
Like for instance, look at Cleveland. I mean, Cleveland's notorious for polluted water. The river caught on fire there 1 year. And yeah, I would think you would want to sample the area there. I mean, if there's only one, and you know, the Toledo area, which is a lot smaller, look how packed that is. You know anything about that?
Yeah, so for the Toledo area, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, you have all of the Great Lakes kind of, well, at least Huron and Michigan kind of go through the Saginaw River, the Detroit River, and then so there's a lot of those high-quality coastal wetlands in that area. So that's why there's a large cluster there, just because there's a lot of sites that you're able to sample. I will say also, like you see all the ones in the UP, a lot of those sites are ones where you pretty much have to carry a John boat back into the middle of nowhere, like a mile back, in order to sample. So they're definitely not letting like sampling bias, like just because it's next door to a university, qualify that as a sampling location. So they have those, like Tori said, they have those 1 year where they sample every year as like reference sites, and then the rest of the sites are on a 5-year basis. So they just get cycled through every 5 years.
Okay,
so they're sampled that way. Yeah.
Dr. B?
Are the wetlands fed by the lakes itself, or are some of the wetlands fed by inland rivers that flow through the wetland into the lake? And if so, how does the health of the river affect the wetland, or is the wetland buffer anything coming potentially to the lake?
Yes.
He knows more about this project than I do.
Oh, that's okay. Well, I had the advantage of working on it 2 summers ago as well as this past summer, and then the graduate student that's working on this project is also in my advisor's lab. So the answer to that is yes to all of that. So the wetlands do a great job of buffering, like a buffer from lake water and the shore, but they also do a good job of filtering anything, like any negative water quality that might be coming from those upstream rivers or from the land that's adjacent to the wetland. I know in the Detroit River we had a couple sites which are really, really pretty, but I mean, they still have like historic sediments that are full of contaminants. So like they recommended, I mean, we had to wear gloves and like, you know, there's a lot of like mercury and heavy metals that are in those sediments yet, which is another tough thing about about river restoration, is that a lot of that sediment never leaves. And if you try to take it all out, I mean, you'd be looking at, you know, millions or billions of dollars, and then you risk stirring up those sediments when you take them out. So.
Second question, the development question. Usually with a development project there is environmental restitution, some sort of offset you have to do. Now in California we had this argument where a company would say, oh, we'll build a golf course. Why golf courses somehow, maybe because the politician got it named after them, I don't know, but how golf courses got issued as some sort of environmental offset, I don't know, but does the law need to be tightened up there? Because it seems to me you can do development and have offsets that are actually beneficial. Or why does development always seem to damage a wetland, or just wetlands just ignored when it comes to environmental restitution?
Personally, I think wetlands are ignored because personally they don't look like much to me. They're just kind of boring. All you see is a bunch of reeds. Like, from my perspective, they're not like a rolling hills or something. You're like, we need to protect this. It's kind of just like a swampy, icky-looking area that probably gets overlooked. Something on that?
Yeah, it's tough because a lot of people, when they do want to develop a nice area along the shoreline, they're required to replace it with a similar area of wetland. But a lot of times when they do that, a human-created wetland is not the same as one that's naturally occurring, which is why this research is so important, because like the ecosystem benefits that those natural systems provide are like 100 times, and that's not even an exaggeration, more effective than anything humans can put together, just because of like the diversity of species in wetland plants, like.
Or a bloody golf course.
Exactly. And what you don't realize as well is a lot of these wetlands have all their seeds in the sediment. So like if you have a dry year, and the water recedes, like some of those can spring up, and you're looking at like 80 years of different species that are all within those, underneath that sediment, just waiting for their chance to explode. And that's not necessarily the case when humans just plant willy-nilly kind of whatever they think goes there. But there definitely are ways that you can make human-created wetlands that are better than others, but just you can't compare with the real thing, if you will.
Yes.
So when you're looking for macroinvertebrates, what are you looking for and why? Like, why is that important?
That's a great question. So when we're picking, we're looking for things that are moving. So that's what you want to get in the jar, nothing too big, but they can be really small. So you're looking for, when you're doing the analysis though, and Nick can speak to this because he's the macro expert, but you're looking for more sensitive species, which is an indicator of the water quality. So if you have a lot of those sensitive species that can survive in areas that don't fluctuate so much, then you're looking at probably some good water quality over a long period of time.
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback off of that, that's why macroinvertebrates are good, like bioindicator, which just means like they are able to tell you about the health of the system. So they're pretty small and they can't really like swim large distances as fish. So you know they're pretty much confined to one area. And as Tori said, it's like a video versus a snapshot. So like if you're finding groups of sensitive macroinvertebrates in an area, you know that the water quality has probably been good there for 2, 3, or more years. And then on the inverse of that, if you're not finding these sensitive organisms that you found in years past, you're okay, like scratching your head trying to figure out why that this is the case, that we're no longer finding these organisms that we've seen in the past.
Any other questions?
How much do you get paid an hour to dig through the mud? No.
It's pretty good. I'll take it. It's better than nothing.
Yeah.
And I get to be outside all day. That's another plus of doing this work, is you get to work in the field. It was field work every day, all day, sometimes 12-hour days. So in the sun, but you get to see a lot of beautiful Michigan wetlands, and it's a really cool project. So.
How do you come upon this job? Like, how did you find out?
That's a great question. So I actually applied to the same graduate program that Nick did through Grand Valley, to the same advisor. So his advisor knew me, and they needed somebody to work on Nick's project with them. And I said, okay, well, if I'm going to quit my medical lab specimen processing job that pays really good to do something that's going to get me some good experience also, but doesn't pay as well, I'd like to work longer. So they said, well, we have the Great Lakes Coastal Wetland Monitoring Program that you can work on. So basically it's kind of who you know and who you marry.
I would add to that, like a lot of positions like this are advertised on different job boards. I know if you keep your eye out, like there's one through the Michigan American Fisheries Society chapter. There's also several other job boards, like Texas A&M is a great one. But a lot of these job postings they're probably going to be posted around now or the next month or two, because they're looking to interview people that are looking to do a lot of work in the late spring and then through the summer. So keep your eye out, and then you can always check on websites, university websites too, because they'll post them a lot as well.
To add to that also, I don't know, I'm sure you've heard from your professors, but what are they, REUs? Undergraduate research opportunities are super important for making connections later on. So if you can get involved with somebody or some organization while you're an undergrad, that's huge for you going forward, especially applying to graduate schools, like I'm experiencing right now. It just gives you, like Dr. Wyman said, legs to stand on when you're talking to graduate professors saying, do you have research experience in this area? Because you do have time. I would say, don't slack off in the summers when you're doing undergrad. Take the time, do research, get experience that you can, and that is going to help you get positions later on.
Preaching.
Any other questions? All right, I'm going to pass it over to Nick.
All right.
Oh, that's beautiful.
do taste delicious. I'll get into that a little bit later too.
Oh.
Not that I've eaten them, but
You wishes.
I do wish. So, I'm Nick Vanderstelt. I've been introduced before, but just a little bit of background. I graduated here, as Dr. Wyman said, in 2019. And then that spring, I got an internship with the Michigan DNR, which turned into a seasonal position. Got to work with lake sturgeon with the Michigan DNR, and then the Gun Lake tribe over in the Kalamazoo area. After that, I worked at the Otto Conservation District doing road stream crossings, which sounds kind of boring, but basically we're just measuring water quality and making sure that everything looks the way it should. A lot of those, where those streams go underneath the road. After that, I kind of started applying to graduate schools, applied to like Michigan State, Grand Valley, and a couple other universities as well. And Grand Valley really jumped out at me in this program, working with the reintroduction of Arctic grayling just sounded so, it was an opportunity that I couldn't pass up, so I tried really hard and thankfully had some previous experience on the Boardman River through Al Savo Institute, which you guys all have access to as well in the summer, so you guys can take classes there and be research assistants as well. So don't be afraid to throw your hat in the ring, and you got to start somewhere. I know, like, trying to get that internship at the DNR, I hadn't heard from anybody in like 3 months and was getting super discouraged. It just kind of happened on a whim, and from there, experience kind of begets more experience. So don't be discouraged, and keep sending out those emails and calling people, and don't be afraid to do that, even though it can be discouraging. So anyway, now I'm at Grand Valley State University at the Annis Water Resources Institute in Muskegon. So that's where I spend that's like where my office is, and where I do a lot of my research, and then I take classes in Allendale. Let's see, my funding is provided through the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa Indians, so they're up in the Traverse City area, and they've funded my graduate research as well as my classes at Grand Valley. I've also had funding through Grand Valley, through the Presidential Research Grant, and then through the Kalamazoo chapter of Trout Unlimited has also contributed some funding to my research as well. So. But today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this beautiful species here, and why we don't see them in Michigan now, but why we hope to do so in the future. So I'll give you guys a quick overview of the species, and then a little bit about my research that I'm doing for my graduate work. So I'd like everybody to, pretend like you're a kid again, put on your little imagination hat, and if you guys step into a little time machine about 200 years ago, thank you, you'll see...
I'm in.
You're in? Good. This is what, if you open your eyes, you're in northern lower Michigan, and this is what one of the rivers may have looked like. So this is actually an old-time photograph that's been transferred over to a print, and this is an Arctic grayling here, sitting on the bank there. So you have kind of all the northern lower Michigan rivers are just absolutely teeming with Arctic grayling. And you can just kind of see the beauty and the other emotions. I don't know if I'm sure you guys took art foundations, but I'm sure Dr. Rick would try to tell you about all the feelings and emotions that you'd get from this photo. But there's a lot of natural beauty, and there's kind of a lot of lore and almost mythical feeling about it. There's a lot of Native American tribes that utilize these natural free-flowing systems, as well as the fish that inhabited mainly the Arctic grayling. But now, if you take a step outside of this time machine, you look around and you don't see any of these fish here anymore in Michigan at all, which is a little bit depressing, honestly. So this is another photo of the Arctic grayling, and this kind of just is, a photo that's really beautiful to me. And it kind of prompts the question, can we allow this fish just to be a remnant of the past? Something that we only see in history books or old photos or old stories passed down. So humans are the reason why these fish aren't in the rivers anymore, and so we kind of have to ask ourselves and look in the mirror and say, is this acceptable? Can we just let these fish and species that are so important to Native American tribes and kind of the history of our state kind of drift off into obscurity? So I'd like to give you guys a quick overview of the Arctic grayling. So here's a pair of them in the river. A distinctive characteristic is this large sail-like dorsal, which has these beautiful colors during their spawning time. They're cold water species, which just means that they really like very, very cold water, and thankfully Michigan has a lot of groundwater-fed streams that stay cold all through the summer, which is particularly important for this species. They prefer coarse substrate, and that just means what's on the bottom of the stream. So they like gravel and coarse sand, kind of like what's pictured here below, as well as they like some aquatic vegetation as well. So their life cycle in spawning, they typically live to about age 7 to 9, and they reach sexual maturity around age 2 and 3, so that's when they're going back and spawning, and they spawn in the springtime, and that's when they get these beautiful colors here on their dorsal fin. They spawn in the main section of rivers, which is a little bit different than some other fish. A lot of other fish like to swim all the way up high, up in the little tiny tributaries, and kind of do their thing there. However, grayling like to do their business in the main channels of the streams. They're opportunistic feeders, so they're just like me, they'll eat just about anything. So anything that's, any bugs that are flying around that accidentally land on the stream, or any macroinvertebrates, which are just bugs that live in the water that are drifting by, they'll quickly go over and check them out, and really the only way they have to interact is to eat it. So they'll eat just about anything. They don't.
Very short.
That's right, they're mostly just like us. If we see them in DC, we're gonna give it a shot. So they don't typically eat fish, but they do occasionally do that. And then the very large Arctic grayling, as well as other trout, will eat like small rodents and stuff like that that happen into the stream as well, which is just kind of cool. So their range in North America is kind of this photo as follows. So you can see the majority of their distribution is here in some of the northern Canadian provinces, as well as Alaska, which is where the bulk of their populations are. And then in the lower 48, we have a tiny little population in Michigan here, as well as this purple dot, which is the population in Montana, and then kind of like the range that they've expanded there in Montana. In Michigan, if you want to whip out your little handy-dandy Michigander map, Arctic grayling were present in the state anywhere kind of above that first set of knuckles that you have here. So Muskegon is right around here, which is where we're going to school. We're, down here somewhere. But this whole region up here, any of those streams, Arctic grayling were the dominant predatory species, or the dominant salmonid in the stream. But like I said, now you look around, since 1936 was when the last one was found up here in the Otter River. But a lot of the decline for Arctic grayling had begun much before this last species was, or this last specimen was found. So these are kind of all of the current rivers that they're looking at, and there's 6 of these that are nominated for kind of these reintroduction efforts, but I don't want to get ahead of myself here. So, as I mentioned, they used to be the dominant salmonid in a lot of these streams, so, what happened to them? I guess the short answer is these humans, these big burly lumberjacks. A lot of Eastern European settlers were drawn to the large hardwood forests and white pine forests we had in northern Michigan. I don't know if you guys ever get a chance, check out Hartwick Pines State Park. There's a lot of just absolutely massive white pines in that section that are, this big around and 130 feet tall. So they're really gorgeous and quite a marvel. But anyway, kind of the logging practice of the day was to go up. You see all of these beautiful dollar signs sitting in front of you, and you just cut it all down. And that was like the logging practice at the time. So this was a problem because the forests surrounding the rivers were really important to a lot of fish, and not just Arctic grayling. So they provide a lot of the food, the base of food. They also provide shading, and they also stabilize the banks, which is really important. If you guys remember earlier, I mentioned that Arctic grayling coarse substrate, but all of the dirt and organic material that those tree roots are holding in, once those trees were cut down, all of that material was able to be washed by the rain into the systems, which made a lot of the northern rivers in Michigan a lot shallower and wider, because a lot of those coarse substrate and deeper, cool running streams were shallowed a little bit by all this debris that ran in. So you can see here on the top of this photo, you can kind of see how the logs go up a little bit. So what would happen is all the logs would be cut down, and then they'd be put in these roll-away zones, they're called. And so these lumberjacks were pretty smart, you have to hand it to them. They'd use the power of the river in order to transport the logs, so they didn't have to carry them. This was the case until the rail lines were more developed, which did happen, but it was kind of too late for the Arctic grayling at this point. So during the spring log runs, what they would do is they would make man-made dams, and they would have all logs stacked up like this. And then when the snow would melt, and then during the spring rain, the water levels would increase, then they'd pull the lever, release the dams, and all these logs would rush down the stream. Now in the rivers, in the kind of the main sections of the river. Now, and if you remember, Arctic grayling are spring spawners. That's when these log runs are happening. They also spawned in the main part of the channel. So you have all this increased turbidity and all these big logs bumping the bottom and kind of scraping the bottom and disrupting all the habitat. So you kind of have these beautiful, fragile little Arctic grayling and these big burly lumberjacks, and so you can kind of guess who's going to win, and that's just kind of the first kind of trident that was against Arctic grayling. So they're also a very vulnerable fish. There's a lot of reports of fishermen using 3 flies and catching 3 fish every cast, and they would just kind of sit on the bank and have a nice little pile of Arctic grayling, and then when their fishing day was done or when it was time for dinner, they'd take 2 or 3 or 4 off the top, and then that's what they'd go home and eat. Apparently they tasted better than whitefish or trout, which if you guys like fish, those are like prized. Exactly. So they'd be very, very tasty, which is another reason, combined with their easy ability to catch them. There's kind of a plethora of over-harvest examples, the one I just mentioned about the piling of the fish, but also there were just entire boats, like fishing trips, they just fill the boat up with fish, and at the end, they'd take what they could. There's even reports of train cars full of like salt-packed Arctic grayling being shipped out to feed the hungry lumberjacks or elsewhere, and also President Ford would ship out some salt-packed Arctic grayling to his buddies out east as kind of a delicate treat for them.
How big are they? How big are the fish?
Yeah, so the largest they can get up to about 2 pounds and about 20 inches or so. So yeah, it's not quite as big as some of the other species that are have been reintroduced now, like the brown trout. But I mean, it's still a pretty sizable fish. So let's see here. Okay, and then this is the grayling line. If you guys have ever heard of Grayling, Michigan, it was named after the fish. So if you're ever heading up 131 and you pass Grayling, that's where it got its name. So this is like the Grayling rail line, which is responsible for shipping a lot of the materials to a lot of the lumbermen, as well as distributing logs later on after the rivers were being utilized for that. So there's actually reports from the town of Grayling. So every year there would be multiple fishing groups that would go out, and they had to go farther and farther and farther away from Grayling in order to get a substantial catch or find any grayling. So that's just another example of how humans had kind of outfished and overutilized this resource as well. The last bit of the trifecta was increased competition and predation. So you have brown trout here at the top, brook trout here in the middle, and then rainbow trout here. So those are the 3 species that were introduced or expanded by European settlers. So brook trout is there's a lot of a hot debate among history. So they were found in some of the streams, but not in the same densities, because as I said earlier, Arctic grayling were like the dominant fish. But when Europeans arrived, they expanded the brook trout stocking, as well as brown trout and rainbow trout were stocked heavily throughout the region. And then this is kind of a little bit of a unicorn right here. This is a tiger trout, which is the offspring of a brown trout and a brook trout. They're really rare. They're like 1 in 10,000 is kind of the odds there. But we actually caught one of them this summer, which was really exciting. So I just thought I'd share that with you.
Are they for real?
No, they're not.
Oh.
Let's see here. So yeah, brook trout, brown trout, and rainbow trout provided additional threats to Arctic grayling. So brown trout and rainbow trout are known to be piscivorous, which just means that they eat other fish. So they also spawn at opposite times as Arctic grayling do. So when these little Arctic grayling would emerge in the spring, you'd have these like year 1 or older brown trout and rainbow trout that are hungry, looking to put on a few pounds for the summer. And then they just eat Arctic grayling likely. And then brook trout aren't as likely to be piscivorous, but there's still a possibility. But in any case, all 3 of these species would have been adding increased competition for the limited amount of resources that were available in the streams. So if you combine the logging impacts, overharvest, and then this increased competition, you can kind of imagine why the Arctic grayling just started to decline. However, and eventually go extinct. However, this was not lost on a lot of Michigan residents, and there were many reintroduction efforts in the state. So the first reintroduction efforts began in 1880, roughly. This is really when a lot of people started to notice that Arctic grayling numbers were declining. So on early stages, what they would do is they would take eggs and young fish, or fry, which is just a fish like this size, from the rivers and transport them from areas where they're doing well to areas that they were struggling, obviously. However, kind of start of 1900 is really when Arctic grayling numbers were dwindling so low that we had to start bringing Arctic grayling in from Montana through rail cars, and then we try to introduce those. So that's what these next kind of reintroduction efforts led to, but all of these efforts failed, and it kind of left a lot of people scratching their head. A lot of these projects were were forced into issue, so they were shovel-ready projects, which is just kind of a phrase just to describe, like, oh, here's the work, we want to get it done, we want to get it done now. We have these fish, we're going to go put them in, throw it to the wall, see what sticks, kind of a deal. They failed to consider the ongoing negative impacts that caused the reduction of the Arctic grayling in the first place, and also they failed. One thing that all of these reintroduction efforts had in common is that all of these are taking fish from one river and putting it into another river, which is actually a really important step that if they would have considered this, the answer may have, or the outcome may have been a bit different. So in Montana, they've actually had success in reintroducing Arctic grayling, although they have experienced a similar reduction in range. So about 90% of their population has been lost, and over 90% of their range has been lost in Montana for the same species. However, this technology, the remote site incubator here, or RSIs as I'll refer to them from now on, have made all the difference. So what is an RSI? It's basically just a glorified 5-gallon bucket. I'm not gonna make it sound too flashy, but you can see here that it takes water from upstream and it forces it down through this pipe here, and then once it comes in the inflow pipe, it flows up through the container there, and then fertilized eggs, Arctic grayling eggs, are put in this egg tray, and once they're ready to hatch, they emerge, and then they flow out here, and then they're down in this stream. So why does this matter? These fish are a lot healthier than hatchery fish, and hatchery fish are just fish that humans raise in order to stock them, and that's how a lot of fish are typically stocked. But for Arctic grayling, it's important that they are reared in the wild, because they're then exposed to all of like the diseases and pathogens and bacteria and fungi that are present in the systems. So many of them will die in this egg tray, but the ones that do survive are a lot more ready for that environment. Additionally, all the time that they're in these RSIs, they're working on their homing mechanism. So for lack of better words, they are able to smell and taste the water that's coming into their egg, and the water that they are kind of spit out into from the RSI, and this allows them to have like a homing mechanism. So when it is time for them to spawn, they're swimming up through the water and they're like, oh yeah, this seems familiar, like I know where I'm going. It's kind of like using your GPS. So it gives them all the ability to get back to where.
So they always go back to the same stream?
Yes. Okay. Yep. And that was a lot of the issue, or a lot of the speculation on why the past reintroductions failed. So they're taking a lot of these eggs and fish from one stream and putting it into another one. So they're kind of confusing these fish, and they're not really sure where they're going. So they weren't able to, meet back up and spawn when it was time, and constantly searching for that place to call home, if you will. So this success in Montana, it was actually pretty interesting. So a lot of these, there were several documentations of streams which had no Arctic grayling, but historically had Arctic grayling, where they put these RSIs in, and then 2 to 3 years later, they observed fish coming up to spawn again, which is super exciting. So that reintroduction efforts have been going on there from about 2000 till current. But this success in Montana kind of rekindled the interest in Michigan. So if Montana's populations are doing better, maybe Michigan has a shot. So kind of the next steps for Michigan were to look at the habitat, see if there's suitable habitat for Arctic grayling of all life stages, from all the way from egg to adult. Additionally, we wanted to take a look at species interaction, so like those brown trout, brook trout, rainbow trout, and seeing if other species may have a positive, negative, or neutral impact on these species, and then to see if RSIs were a possibility in Michigan or some similar technology. So this photo down here was actually from a previous graduate student in my advisor's lab, and he looked at implementing these RSIs in the stream in the Manistee River, which is just below the Boardman. So they used rainbow trout eggs just to kind of like prove that this concept would work, and it was able to work out. And I know Northern Michigan University has also received like $70,000 to work on RSIs and other technology for hoping to see like where we can put these Arctic grayling as well. So what we're doing now is we're developing a broodstock, which a broodstock is basically just like an adult population of Arctic grayling that we can take their eggs and hopefully put them in some of these Michigan streams. So it's really neat. This person from Michigan State, Nicole Watson, she's doing her PhD at Michigan State, and what she does is she gets, I think it's like 10,000 or 20,000 Arctic grayling eggs, in a styrofoam cooler, and that's what her carry-on is from Alaska to Michigan. Yeah. They take those eyed eggs and they raise them at Michigan State, and then they take those fish and put them into 2 hatcheries, one in Marquette, and then let's see, one at Odin State Hatchery. So basically what they're doing there is they're trying to get 4 years of Arctic grayling eggs, and once those become adults, they have to prove that the fish are like genetically diverse enough to support a population, as well as like disease-free. So once the fish meet all of those requirements, which is likely, as the Alaskan populations are doing very, very well. But once that's the case, then we'll kind of be able to look at where these Arctic grayling eggs will be able to put in Michigan. And kind of the general timeline of that is as early as 2025.
So you think you can fool the eggs by putting them in the Michigan stream, and then they'll think that that's where and they'll come back there.
Correct. Yeah, so
they won't remember Alaska.
Hopefully not.
Okay.
Well, if they try to get there, they're going to need some help. So, and then let's see here. We have the Michigan Arctic Grayling Initiative, which was founded in 2016, I believe, with Michigan State and the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, and since it's grown to about 50 partners that are all eager and interested to support Arctic grayling efforts in Michigan. So Grand Valley is one of those partners, as well as the Grand Traverse Tribe, who I'm partnering with. And the goal of this Arctic grayling initiative is where can these self-sustaining Arctic grayling populations be, where can they exist in Michigan, and where can we put them, essentially. Which leads me to my research question. To what extent will the Boardman River and its tributaries support Arctic grayling reintroduction? So the 3 main things we're going to consider here is water quality, the habitat that's there, and then the fish populations that are in the Boardman River. So I'm going to give you guys a quick overview of the Boardman River. We have a different map, but I can explain it to you. There were 3 dam removals in the Boardman River.
All those damn things.
That's right.
Oh, stop.
So there are 3 dam removals on the river, which is really important. So this allows the fish to utilize the whole watershed instead of just sections of the watershed. Those removals happened in the past 10 years or so. Our project considers 13 tributaries. So we're looking at habitat and fish assessments in 8 of these tributaries, and then the rest of the tributaries we're also monitoring temperature hourly. We have an upper and a lower site at each of our 8 tributaries, which just gives us an additional data point. There is some variation between streams, and then an upper and a lower site was kind of our Goldilocks number. We had a finite amount of time and resources that we could use, so this is kind of spreading our net as wide as we could while sampling the most tributaries as well. So this is actually a picture of the Upper Manistee watershed, but it's similar to the Boardman. So as you can see, there's like all these regions and areas where Arctic grayling could be reintroduced. So what we looked at was temperature and water monitoring. So we have all these tiny little temperature loggers that we put out in 28 locations, and we were able to record temperature hourly, which is really important as the summer water temperatures are especially important for Arctic grayling and other trout species. We also used the YSI that Tori talked about, which is a little handheld SON and computer that tells you what the water quality is there. Okay. Bear with me one moment. The slides are completely mixed up, but that's all right.
I think you're sabotaged by the trout.
I really, yeah. It's going to be
their habitat goes away.
nothing else, this is just a reminder to always go through your slides even when you know they have them right.
Well, Nick, Art, can you, all of you go?
Yeah.
Are you doing macroinvertebrate surveys as well?
So my project is not, but there's going to be a bioenergetic study, which is kind of looking at like how much energy, how many macroinvertebrates are able to, like how many fish that energy in the system is.
When the dams were pulled out,
Yeah.
did that affect, because riparian systems usually have, like around here, we have cottonwoods.
Yep.
All over the edges of the river, and they're very important for knitting the shore together. Did that disturb a lot of the trees that were knitting it together, those sorts of things, or were they replanted?
So for the Boardman, it was really interesting. If you guys want to go to one of the coolest natural river areas that's in the state right now, Brown Bridge Quiet Area is a gorgeous place. So a lot of the engineers put in these dams like in the areas where the river had the greatest amount of gradient. So you kind of have this big kind of valley in the river right in the middle of it. And what they did is the engineers actually drilled down and found all the big old growth stumps that were present. So what they do is they find like stump, gravel, and that's how they were able to identify where the original river channel was. But another part of what they're doing now is trying to reforest those areas. So the dam removals did allow the natural flow to return to the river, which is really, really important for a lot of fish species and has numerous habitat benefits. But they do have to re-establish kind of that.
Because you said that they like a coarse bottom.
Right.
And if that riparian environment is not grown back, that seems to me that's going to be tough to do.
Yeah, so that definitely takes time, and that's kind of why that Brown Bridge area is so beautiful and easy to look at right now, just because there's not that, there's a lot of low-hanging vegetation, so you can see for a long way right now, which is not going to be the case in 30, 40 years when a lot of those streams return.
And you don't have those butt ugly dams in the region.
Right. Yeah, there were a lot of fishermen that were upset about the dam removal because it removed a lot of their fishing area, and also it kind of removed the lake or what was above the dam there. Sorry.
You should have been talking through that. I couldn't.
I'm barely hanging on. Any other questions while I keep going on this?
Did you do a summer ensemble?
I did. So I took classes there in 2017. I took stream ecology, lake management, and then one other course, a GIS and water policy course. And then I was back there in 2018 as a research assistant. So I worked on the Boardman River, which is what helped give me this position now. But we looked at those dam removals and how macroinvertebrate communities were responding to the dam removals. And that paper actually just got published on older data, but so hopefully I'll be included in the next one.
So speaking as, I actually am from Grayling.
Okay.
What will you do about like the fishing community there? And if you do end up like succeeding in bringing the young fish back, how will you ensure that they just get fished out?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's a lot of brown trout anglers right now that would be really upset. Like they're like, oh, they're going to be taking my brown trout, or they're going to be taking my brook trout. But kind of the point of reintroducing artificial right now is to try to find where they fit in without, taking away from brown trout or brook trout fisheries. Additionally, there'll probably be some fishing restrictions, at least early on, and then in the future maybe catch and release only, just because these fish are so easy to catch. But I mean, that's maybe 5, 10, 15 years down the road if these reintroduction efforts kind of take root. So, because they do taste good, right?
Is part of their life cycle they go out to the Great Lake and come back?
No, so
They stay in the river the whole time?
Yes, they stay in the river the whole time.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence of these fish that are born in the RSIs that they come back and they spawn in the exact same waters?
Yes, so there is evidence from Montana. So a lot of those, where the RSIs were implemented, were areas where Arctic grayling lived in the past, but were not present since. And the grayling did show fidelity to those areas.
And has those RSIs been used for any other fish other than trout?
Yeah, so RSIs were initially kind of developed for some of the Pacific and Atlantic salmonids out in the west coast, and then were brought here in order to just to kind of see if it will work, which was why they weren't implemented for a long time for grayling. It's just because they were developed for these other species.
How about predatory fish, for instance, walleyes? So I know in Duck Lake they dump a bunch of walleyes in there, but they never reproduce because it's obviously not their same water.
Yeah, so walleye is a little bit tricky. So you can have like put and take fisheries, which basically just means they're stocking fish in there for anglers to go and try to target and eat.
Right.
So the goal there isn't natural reproduction. If it was, they'd probably change their stocking strategies a bit.
But those fish don't, walleyes only reproduce in the waters they're born in, right?
I mean, I know that they do big egg takes on like the Grand River
Right.
and like the Detroit River and stuff like that. So they do definitely reproduce, and there are naturally reproducing populations of walleye in lots of lakes. But I don't know.
The stocker ones won't though.
Usually not.
I'd say Arctic grayling aren't that easy to catch. I spent a week trying to catch them.
Did ya?
Yeah. They
Were you in Montana or Alaska?
Alaska and Yukon.
Okay.
Everybody in my family caught them, but I didn't. they were chasing the spawn of the salmon,
Okay.
but they were not that easy to catch. I think we got 6 or 7 is about all we got. I didn't think.
It's okay. I can. Alright, we'll just keep moving on. So basically what we're doing is we're using Michigan DNR methods in order to set transects across the stream, and there we're taking like water depth, looking at the sediment, and then we're also looking at, let's see what else, just like how much flow is coming through the area. So that's kind of a framework that they already have in place. And once we're done with all of our habitat data, they've developed a system where we can plug it in, and then by that they'll be able to identify which areas are good for Arctic grayling eggs, young Arctic grayling and adult Arctic grayling as well. We also conducted backpack electrofishing surveys at all of our 16 sites, which is really exciting. You look like a Ghostbuster. So basically you have this backpack with batteries on it, and you have a tail, an anode and a cathode, and you kind of run around through the stream, and then the fish, if you dial in the backpack just right, swim towards your anode there, and then that allows it to be really easy to scoop them up and net them. And that's why I was working so hard to try to get my other slide, because I had a little video ready for you guys. So I'll see if we can figure out a way to post that some way. But that was a lot of fun. So what we would do with all those fish that we captured, we would make a little clip on their fin, so an upper clip on the upper site and a lower clip on the lower site. And then, so the first day we'd do the clip, and then the next day we would shock the same section of river, and we'd look for how many clipped fish we had and how many fish that weren't clipped. So this allows us to plug it into a calculation to identify how many fish are in the area, and then basically that all just helps us to identify which fish populations are in those streams, and then if they're going to benefit or hinder Arctic grayling at different life stages. So currently, what we're doing now is the habitat data will be submitted to the DNR. I just submitted it to them last week, so they'll work on plugging that in. And then the fish data that we collected this summer will be used, and then also this spring, we're going to go out to those same sections and do similar backpack electrofishing in those areas to try to identify if those communities change at all in the spring. A lot of the literature says it likely won't change a whole lot, but it's going to be a really important time because that's when Arctic grayling are going to be spawning and when their eggs are going to be present, and then also when their tiny little fry are going to be at their most vulnerable kind of their whole life stage. So my project is kind of like phase one. As I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a bioenergetic study. The Boardman is one of 6 watersheds that's nominated right now to be looked at for habitat and fish communities for Arctic grayling reintroduction. So we're going to start out with those 6. From those 6 watersheds, there'll be a lot of this habitat assessment and where. And by that, we'll be able to identify which areas are going to be most likely to be successful for introducing these eggs into the RSIs or whatever other similar technology they will use in order to put those eggs in. So I guess with that, do you guys have any questions for me? Thanks for bearing with me there.
A lot of us remember the Jordan River from Core 100.
Yeah.
Is anything being done on the Jordan River?
I believe the Jordan is also one of the ones that is being nominated. I think it's the Jordan. I don't want to misspeak. Jordan, Maple, Au Sable, Upper Manistee, and then 1 or 2 more.
What sort of creatures, what sort of fish can the Arctic grayling coexist with? Or is that remain to be seen?
So it does remain to be seen. Nicole Watson is doing a lot of gradation and competition trials with age 0 through 3 Arctic grayling, brook trout, and brown trout in the laboratory at Michigan State. Arctic grayling have been proved to be able to coexist okay with brook trout, which the Otter River, which was the one up in the UP, had really strong populations of brook trout and strong populations of Arctic grayling. And then Arctic grayling have been able to coexist with brook trout in Montana. But kind of the threshold where we have it now, and it hasn't been proven, but this is kind of what everybody's using, is if brown trout are higher than it's 0.1 fish per meter squared, then that's when Arctic grayling start to really decline and the brown trout kind of take over. You got a question?
Yeah. So did your time at Au Sable kind of inspire you on this topic of Arctic grayling? Because I know they talk about that there.
Yeah, so actually, one of the people from Au Sable made the kind of graphic for the Arctic grayling initiative, and there was a lot of talk there. And actually, when I was there, Cameron Goebel, who's doing his master's at Michigan Tech, he's actually on my committee right now for my graduate work. So I was able to go out in the field and help them a little bit, do some of these habitat and fish assessments in the river there. So it definitely was a project I was super interested in, and it wasn't necessarily on my radar, but when I saw it as kind of an opportunity at Grand Valley, I jumped at it as soon as I could. But I think Au Sable was definitely a really formative time because it allowed you to get additional classes that you can't necessarily have here, so fisheries and field-based classes, which are really, really nice because you get to spend more than half the time out in the outside learning instead of being in the classroom, which was super informative and formative as well.
Other questions for Nick or Tori? I want to point out one more time, I hear this a fair amount from students. Is there anything besides biomedical? I tell you all, we do something other than biomedical. These are 2 examples. God allows us to explore all of His creation. It's depth, space, everything. Talk to us. We want to have your help. Nick, Tori, thank you so much.